today, Cara and I are doing a special episode because we saw something on TikTok. But today we're talking about the AI layoff trap. So online, what's swirling is the way that companies are shedding their workforces and blaming AI, which may be a bit of sleight of hand. We'll get into what some Australian researchers said, but also a competing idea of what the AI layoff trap is. But we hope by the end you'll agree with us that there is a different way to go about all of this.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
So the babes are coming to you for a special edition. We don't usually record on a Monday, but so we saw online that there's a lot of discussion happening around something that's kind of coalescing around this idea of the AI layoff trap. And I think we've touched on this a little bit in talking about HR and labor rights, but we wanted to take a moment to talk about what the layoff trap is, why it's probably just covering up for some executive strategy decisions, and what we see happening in the labor force and maybe even some predictions. So Cara, maybe I'll let you kick off with, can you talk about what's going on online right now and what the AI layoff trap exactly is?
Well, it's actually I think it's quite funny because for me, it felt quite evident as soon as it started coming out.
Okay.
Like when a lot of conversations around AI and having these impacts inside organizations and shedding of workforce, more often than not, when I was looking at the business performance of those organizations, all you need to do is look at a P&L on there, and you can kind of see what was coming before that. And I think in a lot of instances, they're using AI as a potential distraction. Now, I think what's happened more recently is that that's becoming more and more of a visible conversation in the zeitgeist. I think there's been coverage, as I was talking with my co-worker just before, I think there's been coverage recently inside New York Times, and I think people are just starting to clue on to what this kind of AI layoff trap was really like kind of espousing. Where it really started is when AI came in, a lot of organizations were, if they were performing poorly or they had this kind of issue inside their P&L, they would say that, we're going to lay off staff in the effort to try and implement AI inside the organization. Or we're seeing these benefits of AI, and so we're able to create these streamlines. And therefore, we're removing staff as part of that. Now, as I said, it just doesn't seem to match up to the math. It's just not, the math ain't mathin', because more often than not, these organizations have had a heavy investment in staff during COVID. So what we kind of saw is a significant amount of overhiring during COVID. What that then meant, in second and third order consequences down the line is they had bloated staff.
Yep.
And they were having to chase profitability and therefore had shed staff. Rather than coming out and saying that, they blamed AI. At the same time, we're having these larger conversations regarding what frontier AI is saying, that this is a truly disruptive, type of technology, and that it completely is going to overhaul the whole of society. I think that is also a play to ensure that there is a level of confidence in what is seemingly a massively inflated market that has not yet created the value that it says it will. So they need to drive that narrative as much as possible. Now, it's a fine line, because what's happening at the moment is we're getting this push and pull of, okay, we've gone too far with this narrative of like, it's all scary and dire and it's going to take over work and this is why it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Or now everyone hates it and is refusing to use it.
So I want to add a couple of points because I thought that was such a good summary. So there's a researcher here in Australia called Uri Gal who looked at kind of the AI layoff trap and the incentives about it. And not to characterize his phrasing, but to me, there's such capital capture logic in it. So what I see, and I think there's kind of two flavors of this in my head. There's the business strategy that didn't pan out, and so we correct and then blame AI because the market values it. So this is like the Jack Dorsey kind of block thing. It's like, was it really that AI was so amazing, or did you just make a $300 million investment in a music streaming company and were over leveraged in crypto? Like, both of those things can be true. And then there's kind of the Microsoft sort of Oracle story, which is, we're investing in data center infrastructure and the money has to come from somewhere and it's coming from staffing costs. So both of those examples are being blamed on AI, and one of them actually has to do with AI, but it's not actually about AI creating so much productivity that we no longer need humans to run a business. So like that is a fallacy. But what Professor Gal was saying is that basically in that situation, you know, the executives and boards and shareholders benefit regardless, in that the P&L is cleaner or lighter, and so that capture happens. But even in the instances we're seeing where companies backtrack, so like the early example was Klarna, who laid off their kind of customer support staff. But Ford recently announced that, you know, lots of senior engineers were being rehired because they were having record recalls because the quality control that AI was supposed to deliver didn't actually happen. And so in all of those cases, kind of the owners of capital or folks higher up on the power chain are still benefiting, right? But those workers are gone, the institutional knowledge is gone, and the ill will is there. So I just wanted to kind of differentiate those two things, and that was an Australian researcher who kind of described that phenomenon. But
just on top of that, like it's quite interesting in tapping into that, because like I saw this interview with Cory Doctorow recently with John Stewart. He was talking about the implementation of AI inside radiology. And in this specific instance, I'm not sure, did you see it?
Yes, I watched the interview. And reminder, Cory Doctorow will be at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas with me on August 22nd.
Good plug. So yeah, I locked it up, bang. But what I was going to say is, like, in watching that interview and where a lot of the mechanics around how AI provides value is in this cost savings narrative rather than the benefit narrative if you use it in coordination with people. And, you know, in the conversation that he was having with John Stewart, it was around radiologists, and there's this whole narrative around radiology being this industry that's going to be completely wiped out because AI is going to be able to do it. It's like, or we can see it as AI is a tool that supports radiologists. In fact, what it might even do is it might even end up costing more money because you've got more radiologists on board who are able to identify and treat cancer in a more effective and, you know, in a deeper way, rather than just when it becomes really urgent and life-threatening. And so it's like, how do we actually connect with those types of use cases as part of that?
Well, and I think part of the thing that the whole interview is worth watching, as long as you are okay with having a rage stroke at any point in the middle of it, not at Cory, just at the things he's describing. But this idea of, it's like in our current market logic, like I think you and I would both agree, and probably most people listening would agree, that like preventing people from dying of cancer at a higher rate is like a good thing, but investors kind of don't give a shit. So like part of the narrative, and I see this with clients, is they're saying, well, productivity this, productivity that, cost cutting that, because they're trying to justify against this really economic logic. But that leads to these kind of AI layoff trap things, which is again, I very gently have to hold clients' hands when I say, you're betting a business strategy on productivity promises that have very thin empirical validation of being likely to exist. And I have not seen a client who is focused on productivity and actually gotten it. So you can do what you want, but I'm just giving you my expert opinion that like what you are doing is self-defeating. And it goes back to like, I think it goes back to this, a point that you made, I don't know where we talk all the time, but you talked about the study that the Australian government has done about the fact that there isn't sort of major workforce disruption. And I don't mean to critique that, but what it didn't measure was job quality and satisfaction in this content. And like, I think anyone listening, if they're thinking that they're like, the message that's being given from on high is make more stuff so that I can have a bigger bonus, is just not a motivating message. Whereas, you know, I'm going through an AI adoption journey with a couple of nonprofits right now, and the objective of the program is to adopt AI in ways that allow us to further our mission. And the thing about that is, like, one, that's motivating to people. They joined the organization because they believed in the mission, but also it creates space for people to actually have critical thinking and to play and be creative and to innovate, not just make more stuff, but how can I lean into the parts of my job that I'm great at and give the computer the parts of my job that I don't love? And so I just, again, coming back to this philosophical underpinning that like so much of the economic and productivity narratives actually keep us from the cool stuff we could be doing with AI.
And I think that's like, it shows a real lack of vision and a lack of creativity. And I think that it really is, and maybe I'm going to get on my, but like it really just is such a masculine view of how this can roll out. Like if we actually spent more time focusing on what the extent to organizations that are providing massive impacts to like if they're able to use AI in a way that's going to be able to extend their mission. And I always say this, if you come into the world and think everything is solved already, then you have a very sheltered view of what the world is, right?
Yeah.
And so like if we're going, okay, the best utilization of AI is to make sure that we can create, I don't know, 1,000 different iterations of a tile ad that's going to serve up to different people. Like what use of AI? Like it's just so, but this is where so much of the investment is going. This is what the Metas of the world are investing in. This is what, this is how it's all structured and where, rubber hits the road for a capitalist, endpoint. I think for me, it's just how do we create that understanding of what the potential is when we're talking to organizations that can use and benefit from AI in a way that it's, okay, there is maybe some productivity gains, but that's not the main thing. It's like, how do we give our staff the resources so that they can be potentially offloading some of the repeatable admin and then working towards where their skills really lie. And this is where when we're talking to counsellors or to, child carers or any of those types of, typically female-dominated industries that are just heavily burdened with administration. It's like, okay, let's figure out how we unlock the potential here rather than be like, okay, we've created this efficiency and now we're going to cut roles. It's just so short-termist but also, like as we've kind of alluded to, just what that means for the future of the technology, because people hate it. People hate it. And we're seeing this massive pushback from Gen Z in implementing it or using it. We're seeing massive pushback in alpha around it. And like, can we not see that and I'm not suggesting in any way that we should be like trying to manifest a future of this and then like hide and put this in. It's like, no, let's use this to be the opportunity to create meaningful change and impact.
But this is something that we talked about, in the last episode around hope. And I think some reading that I've been doing as I'm prepping for my dissertation and the work I'm going to do on disability and AI is actually looking at the imaginary around it. So what is the set of beliefs we have about the future that could exist with it in it? And I certainly don't want to say that like Gen Z or Alpha are wrong. I think that's inappropriate. But if you think about like the hegemonic narrative of what AI does, which is this productivity workforce disruption thing, right? Because frontier labs needed to say that to justify their valuations. Like, why would people not think it sucks? Like, that's a completely rational, reasonable response. And so I think part of our work as people who do actually sit around and think about what could we imagine existing, I think more of that needs to come into the conversation to actually say, and in, I don't know if it was the Jon Stewart interview or another one, but Cory Doctorow talked about like the future is contested. Like, he's a science fiction writer, so he works in kind of these imaginative spaces, but a part of the work of AI that is not necessarily something that you can send an invoice for is what we're trying to do, which is suggest that alternative futures exist. But one of the core kind of architectural challenges of AI is that when used the way it is currently being built, it forecloses possible futures that are different than the past. And so I think it requires us as humans to, like, at least in my work, I like to state the thing that could be possible and then ask people to prove me wrong. In the sense that, like, help me understand why what I contend is a possibility is impossible, right? I'm doing the Elon Musk thing again. But I think that's a part of the work, and certainly that shows up differently when I'm, with a client, but it's actually the same mechanic of saying, I hear you, and I really hear where you want to go. Can I paint you a different world that gets you there in a way that solves a lot of these issues that you maybe haven't anticipated or seen yet? And I think that's the same thing with what AI could do for the economy, right? Like I know there's lots of people like, well, we'll all be artists and all of that. But think about how much legitimate work doesn't get done because we're so busy doing admin. You know, like the NDIS, and I'm so deeply concerned about the way that AI is being implemented. But what if like AI was used to handle the incredibly heavy load of compliance paperwork for support workers instead of acting like people who need specific services are committing fraud when that's not the major source of fraud in the NDIS system? Like we could be looking at AI to create operational simplicity so that care workers could focus on providing that care. But that's not where the focus is. And so I just want to paint that as another example of where we have options and we're choosing a road, but I'm not entirely sure that everyone has realized that there was a fork in the road and they went left.
But I feel that there's also something we have to consider here, which is negativity bias, and how maybe like from an evolutionary standpoint, we need to understand that the reason why fear sells, the reason why everything's been driving towards this mechanic, both with AI, so social media, like all these platforms, fear sells. And the reason why is like from a mechanical like perspective inside our own cognition, we see negative outcomes worse, that we leverage them for longer, we hold them, you know, internally. So if we, like the whole AI layoff trap has been really interesting. So as I said, it's probably something that I would say at the Klarna level, like when I remember when Klarna came out and I was reading and I was like, oh, I'm going to dig into their P&L and see what their last previous releases were. And I'm like, oh, Duolingo's done the same thing. Let me have a look at that. I'm like, okay, cool. This is just a guise. And it doesn't take a lot of to see that, right? Like, and so I was like, oh, I assume that most people would understand that this is what it is. And then with that recent New York Times, like I was talking with my coworker, and they're like, I thought we all knew this, but it just seems like a lot of people didn't clue in. And I suppose you just have to be inside technology.
I think if you're in it, people see it. But if you're just seeing the headlines, I don't think it's not obvious in a world in which most people are getting their news from social media, not necessarily reading the full article. I don't think it's because I don't think it's that they're dumb. I just think that they don't have the depth to know what to look for.
Yeah, exactly. But I also think the thing is that whilst we go the AI layoff, like for example, actually hasn't been caused directly by AI or from these benefits of AI. It is still that, because that's what people are calling this moment in time. And as I said, I know that there is this like kind of common dynamic. And maybe but there's also a market condition that we need to sort of look at, which is why are people rewarding organizations that do this when it's so blatant that, you know, that this is the reason why they're doing it?
And I want to point out there's another use of the language of AI layoff trap that I think actually speaks to that, which is, so what we're talking about is the market that's optimizing for short-term returns. Like we've often talked about the way that the quarter-to-quarter, kind of financial performance issues create all of these distortions in the market. A reminder for everyone that shareholder capitalism ideas really only took hold in the 80s. Hasn't been around that long. We can change it. But there is a paper on Archive called the AI Layoff Trap that actually looks at the macroeconomic effects of this kind of workforce shedding dynamic. And it really looks from kind of a game theoretic perspective, but what happens is that in expectation, where it's individually rational for each firm to say shed about 10% of its workforce over a quite short time horizon, that becomes a horrific optimization point where the tax base collapses, where there's no consumer power because not enough people have jobs to buy the products that the companies are selling. And so I think this points to the necessity of moving back towards a more stakeholder capitalistic model in which corporate leaders are considering something beyond their P&L because they actually understand that their business is interdependent with the rest of the economy and social fabric. And what's interesting is that when I speak to a lot of leaders of kind of large cap organizations, they have been so integrated, and what they will often say is like, oh, well, there is a point at which I need to think past just the organization. But they actually don't have an articulation of what that point is, what the issue is, what the criticality. And it's just because to be successful in that system, you have to be focused on your organization. So all of the behaviors that got you to that leadership point have actually trained you not to do something that is essential in this market. And so again, I don't want to cast blame. I want to look at the structural conditions that, because the folks I'm talking to are good people who are well-intentioned, who care about the world. Like, but the structural incentives surrounding them are preventing them from taking the kind of aggressive action. And part of it is because they know the market wouldn't reward them for doing it. So I just wanted to name that the AI layoff trap that's kind of going on online is this kind of AI redundancy fallacy, but the AI layoff trap as kind of a macroeconomic pattern is also a different line of academic research.
And look, I think that this is like a nexus point, right? Like we're seeing, I think up until this point, there has been at least enough leverage inside a middle class to consistently kind of keep a thread. Whereas, we're talking about there hasn't been a massive disruption to potentially unemployment, but there is a pretty massive disruption to worker satisfaction.
Yep.
And I think more people feel that, and whether like what it looks like in numbers versus what does it feel and represent inside levels of people's feeling of inclusion inside their societies, is that they feel like they're being left out. They feel like they're being put behind. They're not having the same quality of life. Obviously, we can see what's happening in the States in terms of the next generation not feeling or not being able to have the same advantages as their parents did. And that creates this massive disruption in the social fabric if you can't see the potential of what that future would look like. And so that's why I kind of like look at when we're doing AI education for workforces, it's not just like here's AI as a tool. The most important part of AI literacy is being able to understand what your role may look like in a changed world down the line. And that requires a level of abstraction or understanding of vision for yourself, not only just for an organization. And I think that that's such a more interesting place to play for a lot of people navigating this space. Is it's not just, okay, my job gets impacted by AI, for example, but then what do the skills that I have represent in an AI augmented world? And more often than not, we have these great opportunities to realign to more human-based skills. And we're just not seeing that in like the types of education processes or the types of onboarding that's happening inside organizations when they're putting AI into place. It's more purely around this productivity line item rather than flourishing.
And like to go a step further on the productivity thing, it's individual productivity. So what's interesting in some of the clients and organizations I've talked to is they often will give someone a tool and some maybe even free resources to improve what I would call their technical skills about understanding how an LLM works and all of that. And I think that is important. But often what they don't understand is that making the individuals more individually productive does not actually produce team level outcomes. And there's research showing that it is not a linear path to that. And what we often see is that folks, what they actually want. People are seeing resistance as if it's AI rejection, and what it actually is, but all the processes are changing, and I don't know how to deal with the next team over, or how do I do this? And so it's actually a systems challenge problem. And so that's the other thing is teaching people, obviously at the Ethics Center, we're really focused on ethical decision-making around AI. So how do you manage risk in a way that considers something beyond compliance? Because regulations and compliance actually don't address all of the issues that will come up in governing this technology. But that's a lot of it. And so when I come in and I'm doing skills training, my US business is a lot with HR and kind of DEI folks, is the first thing I say is like, you already know how to do this. I'm adding some content to your toolbox so you understand this technology, but scaffolding decisions, having discernment, judging complex human interaction, you are bringing that expertise into the room already. So I don't want you to think you're going from 0 to 1 in this class. You're going from 80% to 85% here with me. And so when I start basically all of my teaching with that, I am teaching a couple courses at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas about how to use AI without becoming its employee. And it's that same thing of, you know your job, you know the processes, you know the considerations. There's a ton of what you know that isn't written down. If we started from what could you build with your knowledge about AI? How do you take control? And it's a creative and innovative exercise. Like, It's almost sold out. But my point is that when you actually tell them that they're smart and creative and they have the ability to innovate, people like it. It's fun. And so that's part of it for me is like, do I think it's partially saving the world? Yes. But is it just a better human experience? Also, yes.
Yeah. And I think that's like, I always come back to that thing do we think that the current sort of work landscape is deeply human? I don't think I know any 5-year-old that goes, I want to spend all day working inside Excel spreadsheets. Like, it is not a thing. It's not a reality. And I don't understand how giving up some parts of this deeply inhuman kind of structure is to our benefit. Now, I understand the concern there is that, of course, the people that are currently in charge are doing this with very limited concern for what it means for people. And I definitely do feel that the more we kind of aggregate together, I'm totally, how do we support professionals unions? How do we create more advocacy inside this space? Because I think that this is let me rephrase that. AI is not a short-term blip. AI will be around, and I don't think that that's the argument. More the fact of how it's being navigated at the moment inside a leadership cohort will change. It will absolutely change. And I think that the leaders who have been caught inside this absolute hubris will be held accountable for it at some point. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's in a sort of dark, revolutionary way, but I think that people will ultimately remember how people were treating others during this time and how it made them feel, like just the level of insecurity that people have had towards how they survive.
I think that's right. And like, I'm conscious that we're time, but I think everything you've just said points out to the idea that people are going to remember that those who are driving this particular version of adoption had choices, and they're going to remember which ones they made. And so that's kind of, the teaching work that I do is like, you always have multiple options of how you respond to a situation. And what I want to equip you with is the judgment and discernment to make the ones you choose on purpose aware of the benefits and consequences. But I genuinely think if we actually gave people an alternative path of what an AI augmented world could look like, which includes building the entire infrastructure from the ground up in ways that are better, right? That there would be a lot more people who would be excited about it. But I also think we would be more productive. Like, that's the funny thing is I'm making the human argument because I care about the humans in the machine. But I actually think we might get the economic gains as well. And I think that's what makes me a bit crazy is I'm like, if we went a different way, it would be better on a lot of levels. Yeah. And so I guess that's our challenge to folks listening is like, be discerning about what the headlines are saying, like read the article and see if you can notice those mechanics, but then also ask, is there another option? And don't accept no as the first answer. And
I think that, when you're talking about is there another option, it doesn't necessarily need to be AI or not AI. It's typically more, what are the use cases? And how do we interrogate use cases to a degree that it's in benefit to workforce, to vision, or to community at large?
Yeah. Well, and I think that goes back to fewer binaries and more contextual, thoughtful decision making.
For sure.
All right.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?